Welcome to Twin Talk Politics. Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Twin Talk Politics. And today we are beyond honored to be joined by Professor Nolan McCarty, Susan Dodd Brown Professor of Politics and Public Affairs, and the Vice Dean for Academic Affairs in the Office of the Dean of the Faculty at Princeton University. He is one of, if not the leading scholar in polarization, democratic institutions, and political economy, and we're just immensely excited to speak with you today.
Great. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah, so we actually have a tradition on our podcast where the first question for all of our guests is a question of dumb luck. So if it's not evident by our very similar looks or the podcast name itself, Twin Talk Politics, we're twins, unfortunately. So we are wondering if you could take that 50-50 blind guess at who do you think is Jason and who do you think is Jerry, just based on our different colored backgrounds. No pressure, no pressure.
Oh, it's tough. I'm going to say the yellow background is Jerry.
Oh, that's wrong. Close call. I'm Jason.
Yeah, close call. I had 1 out of 2 chances.
Yeah, there we go. Yeah, I'm Jason, the one in the orange background, and that's Jerry in the blue background. Great. Now that you know how to tell us apart, let's dive straight in the interview. Now, obviously, Jerry and I know and are well familiar of all the phenomenal work you've done. But for the listeners at home who might not as be familiar, we were just wondering if you could give us a quick introduction of who you are and maybe how you got really interested and involved in political science in the first place.
Sure. So as you introduced, I'm Nolan McCarty, and I teach here at Princeton. I've actually been working on polarization in the United States for almost 40 years now. Not closer to 35. I started out was a graduate student at Carnegie Mellon University, and I was working with my faculty advisors on ways of measuring polarization, and we refined and developed a measure and started writing on it. And our first publication was in the early 1990s. Interestingly, a lot's changed since then, but the trends that we identified are not one of those things. We detected a rising level of kind of partisan conflict in Congress going back to the 1970s. We've worked on it for 30 years to try to understand it. At the same time, those trends have continued. And therefore spent a lot of time over the past few decades trying to both to understand why partisan conflict in Congress and our other national institutions has grown. I've extended it to the American states and found very similar trends. And then I've also spent some time trying to figure out whether particular types of reforms, whether they have to do with how elections are conducted or campaign finance is regulated, might have some effect on reducing polarization.
Sure. Thank you for that. And we'll touch on pretty much almost all of the subjects you just mentioned. But we want to start with one of your central ideas, as you said, that you explore polarization, especially looking at your book, Polarization, What Everybody Needs to Know. And we would love to sort of initiate with what you sort of describe as one of the main drivers behind its increase, the doom loop, the idea that inequality and polarization actively reinforce one another. And I'm 100% sure Professor McCarty will explain this far, far better than me. But essentially, to our understanding, as inequality rises, economic elites often gain stronger incentives and resources to resist redistribution, backing candidates and parties that protect their interests and pulling policies further apart. And because of that, in turn, polarization produces legislative gridlocks that blocks reforms like tax changes or welfare expansion, which might otherwise reduce inequality. So the result is a self-reinforcing cycle where policy becomes immobilized, inequality deepens, and polarization hardens. So our question is, given your very intriguing framing, what does this dynamic mean for citizens' trust and confidence in public institutions, and what risks does it pose for democracy's resilience over time?
Right. Well, that was a great summary. I don't think you need me here. You did a perfect job summarizing. I want to go back and touch on a few details. Our premise started with the observation that if you go back to the end of the Civil War in the United States, the beginning of Reconstruction, 1870s, and kind of move forward, there's a very strong correlation between the levels of polarization that we measure in Congress and the levels of income inequality in society. During periods in which income inequality is very high, polarization is very high. During periods in which inequality is low, polarization is low. And so you see this cycle, from the beginning of the 20th century with high polarization to the middle, with low polarization and inequality to the period we're in now, which polarization and inequality is high. And so, we argue naturally that, in any democratic society, conflict among different income groups is going to be kind of central to organizing the politics. So it seems a pretty natural, hypothesis that when economic conflicts emerge, they get translated into political conflicts. And then the other half of the cycle that you mentioned is that, polarized political systems often aren't very responsive to certain types of demands for income redistribution, which then, exacerbates the inequalities and therefore, has the effect of feeding back into the polarization. So the question you asked though is how that affects trust,
Right.
citizens' trust in the output society. I don't have a good sense of trust. I think there's a sense in which poor governance, which may or may not be related to political polarization, leads to declining trust in our institutions. And when there's less trust in our institutions, a few things can happen. One is people who say have resources, uh, who may, for altruistic reasons, other reasons, may be willing to be taxed in order to
Yeah.
support a strong welfare state. Uh, just, or become skeptical that those resources will be well used, that they will be, either misappropriated by the government or that the poor not deserving of those resources or for whatever reason. So it sort of diminishes a kind of willingness of the middle class, upper middle class to engage in building a welfare state. And it perhaps also causes lower income people to also kind of disengage from politics and not participate,
Yeah.
and therefore reduce the political demands, for redistribution in the welfare state. So I sort of agree with your premise that trust can be kind of an intermediate factor, in these mechanisms. Another strong correlation with polarization, and this may or may not surprise many people, is that polarization in the U.S. tends to be highest during periods of high immigration and high racial ethnic
Wow.
diversity, and lower during lower periods. So again, going back to the cycle I described, where polarization is very high at the beginning of the 20th century, low in the middle, and high at the end, is totally consistent with both flows of immigration and stocks of foreign-born residents. So, as you probably know, at the beginning of the 20th century, there was mass immigration from Europe. It shifted from Western Europe to Eastern Europe. Immigration from Asia began to increase, and then Congress, shut it down. They passed an Immigration Act, which made it very difficult for nationalities who weren't well represented already in the U.S. to immigrate. So that mostly affected Asian, African, Eastern European.
Yeah.
And they didn't change that until the 1960s. And then after the 1960s, you see the very large increase in immigration and diversity. And so like income, since kind of racial diversity leads to conflicts that get mapped onto political systems, there's a very high correlation between polarization and diversity. I think that may have more to do with trust than the income because I think the cultural differences, cultural distances, unfortunately create kind of a natural mistrust
Yeah.
that can be exploited by politicians. Um, we see that, we see that unfortunately happening every day. So I think those two factors together, they're related in some ways and distinct in others, but I think they sort of contribute to kind of a current situation where we're not only polarized, but we really do mistrust the capacities of government to solve problems. Either we don't think government can solve problems, or we think government will be biased in favor of one group over another, and therefore don't want government
Yeah.
intervening.
Yeah, thank you so much for bringing that cultural element in. And just building again on that intersection between economic inequality and polarization, we actually wanted to discuss a model in your work, specifically the interaction of two different groups. We know you show how individuals who stay within their own in-group face lower risks, but also smaller gains, while crossing into another group offers higher potential rewards, but also at the same time poses greater risks. And you show that during economic upswings, people are more willing to reach cross groups and establish that intergroup connection and bond. But in downturns, they retreat in their own communities, feeling that entrenchment and affective polarization. And what stood out to us was, and was super surprising, was that you're finding that once intergroup trust erodes, it's extremely difficult to rebuild, even after economic conditions have improved. So, given this dynamic, how do you think we should think of fostering economic and social environments that encourages this cross-group cooperation? And do you believe that there are institutional interventions capable of restoring trust once it has eroded?
Yeah, that's also a very good summary of paper. Again, the main idea, in that paper was that you have potential interactions within your own group and across groups, and those people who are willing to engage people from other groups. We model as a financial gain, but it can be also other gains, and so people are willing to take chances and interact with people who are distant from them. Potential have expected higher expected gains, but have a much greater risk of being disappointed. So during good times where a bad transaction or two, a bad interaction or
Yeah,
two doesn't matter very much, people are more willing in the model to take those chances. During periods of low economic performance, people become less willing to take that because the risks are too great. Then the observation of the model is that it's become very hard to restore because one of the reasons why people don't interact across groups is that they don't expect others to reciprocate. So if you get into this outcome or equilibrium where nobody's reciprocating across groups, nobody's going to initiate those engagements. And so it's very, very hard, to restart that trust going forward. The solution that we offer, I mean, it may not be one that we can implement, is that this is a role of welfare states, which is to make sure that people's downside risk is not so bad that they're unwilling to engage,
yeah,
people from other groups or out groups, take chances, um, sort of protect them on the downside. And if you can do that, then you don't get into that bad equilibrium in the first place. But once you're in that bad equilibrium, not even establishing kind of more social and welfare protections will get you out of that. So it's not an entirely optimistic
yeah,
take, but it does suggest that kind of a dynamic which we may or may not have seen, which is that the really bad economic times of the past 15 years were
mm,
2007, 2008. Obviously, that led to, it contributed to, I won't say it led to, um, greater opposition to immigration, greater, you know, racial and ethnic conflict. And then the economy got better the conflict stayed. And that's, roughly consistent with what we predict, unfortunately,
Definitely.
because, we don't really have a good solution or a lot of good thinking about how to get out of that bad equilibrium that I think we've kind of gotten ourselves into.
Yeah, thank you so much for that the response. And we kind of want to shift a little bit more into the historical perspectives of polarization. We know you've done extensive work showing and researching how polarization actually began with the political elites, whether that be political activists, congressional leaders, and interest groups, rather than with the ordinary voters themselves. And I think this was mainly a response to incoherent party structures of the 1960s and 70s, where the Democratic Party ranged from labor-oriented liberals to conservative segregationists, and Republicans included both a liberal labor Republicans and those staunch conservatives. And you pointed out that it was conservatives in particular who recognized that in order to advance a more clear agenda, they first needed to dominate their party by moving it closer to the right. And the Democrats soon followed. And from your research, you actually found that conservatives were comparatively much more successful in their effort to do so. So our question is, what specific type of polarization, whether that be policy, ideological, or partisan, best explains the conservatives over the Republican Party's success?
Yeah, so I think that uh, so what you're describing is what we call an asymmetric polarization, where the what we see coming out of the 1970s is the Republican Party is moving to the right, much more quickly than the Democratic Party is moving to the left.
Mhm.
One one small detail about the historical summary you gave. I actually don't think it's that the Republicans necessarily recognized it first or saw it more important. If you go back to the 50s and 60s, progressives were very concerned, like how can we be a progressive party and
Right,
have conservative
right, okay.
Southerners in our party? Uh, it's just that they needed those conservative Southerners to continue to win elections. Without the support of the South, um, they would have lost many presidential
Mhm.
elections and congressional majorities that they actually won over that period. So in some sense, they were disadvantaged because they were winning, and they had a winning coalition, and it was harder for them to give that up in order to
Mhm.
kind of purify the party.
Okay.
Republican Party, on the other hand, had the advantage of being mostly on the losing side, especially when it came to Congress. And so they had a greater incentive to kind of shake things up. And they saw the opportunity of building coalitions with conservative Southerners, whether it be in terms of racial politics, skepticism about the Civil Rights Act, or some political science would say racial resentment, or just simply that the South was a very highly fast economic growing area and had sort of natural Republican constituencies emerging there. Republicans were in this situation where they could improve their lot by trying to recruit the Democratic conservatives into their coalition. And I think that probably had the effect of more driving out the Republican liberals than the Democrats, did in terms of drawing them. Um, so, the Republican advantage, I think, in large part was that, at the time that these transitions took place, they were the party that, had stronger incentives to move. Uh, and then I think for the most part, they tried to put together kind of a conservative programmatic party. Um, wasn't entirely coherent. No party's ideologies are
Yeah, for
ever
sure.
coherent. But they found a good mix of kind of low tax, low regulation, strong national defense, and we'll just say skepticism about the federal government's role in race relations. uh, that could, attract significant numbers of conservatives, uh, from the South. And then the party becomes identified more strongly as a conservative party, and that helped attract other conservatives. And so therefore, the party system sorted more clearly on a kind of a left-right spectrum than it had before. Again, primarily because the Republican Party was in a position to take advantage of the split in the Democratic Party.
Sure. Still on the theme of polarization as a whole, we wanted to shift gears a little bit and approach it from the angle of media. In today's very, very fragmented media environment, politicians are unfortunately often rewarded with airtime for conflict and partisan attacks, while algorithms on social media amplify emotional content, sensationalism, and even many times misinformation and disinformation. Your research has shown that citizens increasingly also self-select into sources that just reinforce their own political views, deepening partisan divides as well as echo chambers. And you've also pointed to both revitalizing local journalism and changing the incentive structures of big media as possible responses. So we're just wondering on this idea holistically, how effective do you think these reforms and approaches can be, and over what kind of timeline might we realistically expect to see their impacts?
Sure. Just to be clear, what you're describing is not my research, but research I reported on.
Yeah,
Others say
sorry.
the stuff on sorting and media is my colleague Marcus Pryor, and then the work on newspapers have been done by Jim Snyder and others. So just to give them credit where credit's due. But I do think those are, with some modifications, are very kind of compelling arguments. Let me start with the local newspapers because I think that is an area in which perhaps more progress could be made more quickly. Um, for reasons I don't quite understand, I'm not sure anybody quite understands. There tends to be a very strong association with political polarization and the nationalization of American politics. And that by nationalization, we mean that regular everyday voters increasingly focus exclusively on national politics, national political debates, ideological questions that are influenced by national politics, and then cast their votes based on national partisan considerations, even in local elections. So your vote for mayor is based on how you feel about the president
Yeah, yeah,
and
right.
the party of the president or governor. And so it gives us really has two effects. One is it kind of moves attention away from local problems, which is intrinsically a problem of itself. You kind of see this in New York City with the mayor's race now.
Yeah, right now, yeah.
A lot of the stuff in the mayor's race now is about U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. It's not about New York, making the
Oh,
subways work better in New York City. There's some of that. I don't want to overstate it, but the fact that so much attention is focused on how the mayoral candidates position themselves with respect to Israel and Gaza is not a good thing for the governance of New York City. That's a position I will stick with. But it's manifest in lots of other areas. The strongest correlation in terms of how a party does in its kind of state lower house elections is the public approval of the president. So there are all these things like that that kind of taking attention away from local politics. And it's very hard to get attention back on local politics when there's
yeah,
no news media there to cover it. So that's the connection. So I'm not saying it would eliminate polarization, but at least if there were better coverage of kind of local politics, might engage more people in local political debates, which can be very constructive to improving the lived experiences of people who are in those cities, or state. It's not just cities, but state politics as well. So revitalizing local coverage. The other thing the local coverage does is that it sort of tells a constituency how their member of Congress is performing, and then they can hold them accountable.
well, yeah,
Now, because there really isn't local coverage, every member of Congress has a national constituency. So they want to go out, even if they didn't want to, they kind of got to go out to either Fox News or MSNBC, try to get on, so they can, say something really, shocking so
Mhm.
that they can get some donations from people, from everywhere in the country because their local constituents don't have enough information to really know, and they're not all that engaged. And so it seems natural that then with this kind of decline of local media coverage that politicians really incentivize, okay, I've got to build a national constituency. Where am I going to do that? I'm going to do that on cable news, or I'm going to do that on TikTok.
Right.
And that's that's not very, I mean, that's not very helpful. That's not very helpful either. You know, getting rid of TikTok or cable news is not going to happen. But maybe you can somebody can. I don't know if you two can. Somebody can maybe help revitalize local news and help people understand why it's really important, especially in a system like the U.S. where we have this geographic representation, and it's very important for accountability for people to understand and know what their members are doing and to focus on their issues and how it affects them rather than um, succumbing to kind of rage bait on social media. So um, I think media is very important, at least for amplifying polarization. I mean, I think there still would have been polarization if we still just had three broadcast news stations, but I think the change in the media environment is really accelerated it and led to some outcomes that would have been worse. It would not have been as bad had we had a more stable media environment.
Cool. Thank you so much. And we'll definitely be touching a little bit more on accountability later on. But now we kind of want to transition a little bit away from polarization and to another part of your scholarship, which we find immensely fascinating, which is on the political economy and campaign financing, especially in regards to your book, Political Bubbles, Financial Crisis, and the Failure of American Democracy. In the case of the 2008 crash, now we're very familiar with what happened to the financial bubble, where markets were inflated beyond their fundamental. But you also extended this fascinating parallel into the idea of political bubbles, where interest groups, large campaign donors, and polarized parties prevent course correction. And your research actually shows how campaign contributions and lobbying inflate these bubbles by distorting incentives and blocking effective regulations or crisis responses. And as you point out, it's not necessarily the case of corruption, but a systemic policy capture where the very structure of campaign finance and partisan competition intrinsically aligns with politicians' incentives, with powerful donors and intergroups, even at the expense of long-term stability. So our question is, looking at the present, do you see areas like technology regulation, climate policy, or healthcare where you think new political bubbles may be forming? And what signs should we be looking out for as those early indicators?
Political bubbles, I think, can emerge uh, in some sense without the lobbying, without the campaign contributions, without the kind of the wealthy influence. Or just simply the idea that politicians, re-election seeking politicians, always going to have sort of an incentive to kind of let the good times roll. So the idea of just a bubble, put aside donors, financiers, whatever. You have a financial bubble. A lot it's dragging up the economy. Housing starts are way up. A lot of construction, a lot of new people are getting their housing. You as a regulator say, well, this isn't sustainable. The right policy would be to kind of slow it down, to regulate it, make it a little bit harder to uh, borrow money to buy a house or, to raise the kind of mortgage approval requirements, whatever. Just have to regulate. But you're the politicians that appointed you are going to lose votes because people had it good. There's going to be an intervention. Things are going to be less good for those people.
Yeah.
They're going to vote for the other side. So that is just a basic fundamental tension of democracy. So it's always there. And
Okay.
we highlight in the book, there's some cases where it seemed to be there, in the past before we had the current campaign finance system. But with the campaign finance system, the lobbying, it does make things worse because then you have a financial bubble, this kind of acceleration of asset prices and housing prices, then the people who are going to be harmed by you pulling back uh, regulatorily or in terms of monetary policy, not just the voters, but it's the support, it's the people who are supporting campaigns, providing information to politicians. They're going to argue against it. Campaign contributions are at stake, and it just I mean, so it accelerates. And so that's the only slight, thing is like we could do everything to make our politics cleaner and lobbying more equal, and we would still have this dynamic in a democracy. Now, to your question, could it appear in other areas? Almost certainly. Cryptocurrency regulation is
Yeah.
perhaps one of the easiest examples. It's almost the same argument. You have a situation where I would argue perhaps the Biden administration was too restrictive on crypto, and it hurt them politically because there was not just a lot of crypto billionaires wanted deregulation, but a lot of routine investors sort of thought it would be a good opportunity they'd wanted. And
Sure.
then the market goes way up, and then a lot of sort of vested people. And then, even if there were regulators in the current administration who thought this is a little frothy, we need to rein it in, their political incentives to do so would be, limited both through votes and through campaign finance and lobbying. So crypto is a good example. You could tell stories. You could tell stories about AI in the same sense
Yeah,
that
for sure.
uh, even as the dangers become more apparent to regulators, the new regulation is going to have winners and losers, and the winners are going to mobilize politically against any regulator who proposes it. So the regulator is going to be more hesitant to step in. So I do think the idea of the political bubble, it kind of transcends the specifics of the case we developed it on to these other cases.
For sure. Thank you so much for that. And we completely agree. Um, we want to switch gears a little bit here and dive into your recent and fascinating work on representation and voting, since it connects closely with a lot of our own research and our advocacy in extending the voting age. So, in recent years, a great deal of attention has turned to reforms of single member plurality systems, with ranked choice voting gaining, I would say, significant traction. Supporters highlight how it expands the fields of candidates, broadens voter choice, and aims for majority support. Yet, as you pointed out, it also has significant drawbacks, such as producing non-majority winners and high rates of ballot exhaustion. And what we found most intriguing was that it disproportionately weakens the very voices of minority communities it seeks to empower. So our question is, given these dynamics, do you think reformers should continue to heavily pursue ranked choice voting, or are alternative systems like PR or multi-member districts better suited to fostering participation and ensuring fair representation, especially for marginalized groups?
Great. That's a great question. So my view, ranked choice voting, of course, as you know, is a system primarily used to elect a single representative from a single district.
Yeah.
And it replaces plurality voting by asking voters to rank all the candidates and then using a process of elimination to get it down to a single winner
Mhm.
by transferring votes from eliminated candidates to the viable candidates. My basic takeaway with ranked choice voting is that the problem is not plurality voting per se. It's really the single member district. There's just only so many ways to do that, to elect a single member district. And so ranked choice voting, uh, perhaps has some plus sides, and I've argued has some downsides. Mostly not absolute downsides, but just the things it purports to do, it doesn't really do that
Mhm.
well, or doesn't provide uh, significant enough benefit to justify, having a more complicated, confusing system. So, for example, as you mentioned, Ranked choice voting purports to ensure that the winner has a majority support in the final round. But that rarely happens actually, because not many voters, not all voters rank all the candidates, and so oftentimes voters have their votes eliminated before the final round, and
Around, yeah.
so usually the final round is won by somebody who gets 40% of the votes total, which is not that different from what you would see under plurality voting. So it's just an area where I think it's been a little bit oversold. It says it solves a problem, and it doesn't clearly solve that problem. It doesn't make it worse than plurality voting. It's just the advantages in this particular area, the advantages are smaller. The place where I think ranked choice voting is more problematic and maybe worse than plurality voting has to do with minority representation. Because at the end of the day, ranked choice voting is a highly majoritarian
Hmm.
system.
Yeah.
It's designed to make sure that the winning candidate gets a majority, and in some contexts, it's a very good thing. But in the context of a world in which everything is a single member district, makes it very hard for there to be minority representation if every district has had kind of a strict majority rule. Um, and this has been recognized for a long time. The United States, when before it got stripped out of the Voting Rights Act, had a process called pre-clearance, where a city would have to go to the Justice Department and ask to change the rules. Uh, and if they asked to switch from a plurality voting system to a majority voting system in an area that was racially polarized, the Justice Department would say no, because it was understood to be disadvantageous to minority voters when there's racially polarized voting. But advocates of ranked choice voting in the United States have just sort of, they want it in every election. They're not paying that much attention to whether or not the electorate's racially polarized or not. And what often happens in kind of a racially polarized system is that the majority candidates compete with each other to get into the final round by being the best majority candidate that they can be. And then, you know, then the minority candidates will face a majority candidate in the last round, and then they will lose for sure.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
Actually, reduce minority representation over plurality rule. There's a paper by Peter Buisseret of Harvard and Carlo Prado of Columbia arguing that. The other thing that happens, which you alluded to, and I think this also has to do with racially polarized voting, is that racially minority voters tend not to rank as many candidates as majority voters, because most candidates are majority candidates. And so it often means that you get to the final round, the ballot exhaustion rates of African Americans, Hispanics, and Asians tend to be much higher than those of kind of white voters. And so that's kind of a second order reduction in their influence, because the final round, especially in racially polarized areas, the final round often has a dilution of the numbers of minority voters in the final round. Uh, and that's also not an issue that the reformers have been all that willing to engage with. They argue that ballot exhaustion is a choice, ranked choice voting expands the choices. If you don't rank all the candidates, that's a fine thing to do. But you have to question that when it's kind of systematically concentrated among certain groups. And it tends to be worse when those groups don't have enough candidates of their own
Right.
to support. It shows that they're not being mobilized in the way that ranked choice voting advocates say they should be mobilized. So I think that is actually a concern. Um, I think reformers should move away from uh, just this kind of cosmetic fix. I'll just call it a cosmetic fix on
Sure.
plurality voting, and think more about other alternatives. So you mentioned plurality rule, I mean, proportional representation, multi-member districts. Um, I think those are much more likely to have some impact. They're much more likely to create more factions and perhaps more parties.
Yeah.
Therefore, the choices will be more identifiable to voters.
Right.
Um, can you imagine if you're a voter in New York City, you go and vote in a ranked choice voting primary, and there are 13 candidates
Wow.
on the ballot?
Yeah.
How are you supposed to do that? How are you even supposed to know which two are going to be in the final round to do that? But if you have, multi-member districts and people are endorsed or cross-endorsed by a variety of parties, there's just a lot more information to the voters to
Right.
understand how to do that. The other alternative, which is kind of meets halfway, is to expand a system that they've had in New York State and Connecticut for a long time, which is fusion voting, which allows
Yeah.
minor parties to endorse major party candidates, which creates potential factions within the majority parties, which voters can, leverage off of and, get information from to make choices. So there's a lawsuit in New Jersey to expand fusion voting here.
Wow.
I don't think it's going to revolutionize American democracy, but
Sure.
at least it's a reform that will move the ball in the right direction without necessarily disadvantaging an identifiable set of voters.
Cool. And just one final question before a fun question to wrap everything up. I think intuitively, we think that the greater transparency always equates to a greater chance to establish a compromise between parties. But I think as you've spoken about before, about a paradox that the greater transparency and the sunshine laws in congressional negotiations can actually reduce the chance of compromise since members fear backlash from their own partisan bases. So our question is, how do you think about balancing democratic accountability with the practical need for private bargaining? And do you see any reforms that could create the space for compromise without undermining public trust?
Yeah, I think that's right. I've long been concerned that there's kind of a fetish on transparency, and that in the extreme, no two public officials should be allowed to meet without a microphone, without a
Yeah.
microphone there. And I think that does make political compromise and bargaining harder. It makes it harder for people to make compromises because some compromises are going to be unpopular with some of their constituents and so forth. So I've always thought there should be more space for private
Yeah.
negotiations, private meetings. Uh, that said, I think I think certain things should be transparent. I think legislative, roll call voting should be transparent. People should be accountable, for how they do that. Uh, People should be stand behind and be accountable to the things that they support and then the things that they oppose. But in the purposes of reaching an agreement about what it is they're going to vote on, I think they should have some space to do that a little bit more privately. I mean, the downside is like it's being done privately anyway. I mean, it's just being done in leaders' offices, not in committees where committees have the expertise. So all the private stuff goes on, with the leaders. And so giving the committees at least some room to actually work some of these things out on their own, I think would be actually a democracy enhancing reform because it would mean that there's more diverse input from legislators on the outcomes than there is in this kind of leadership driven process that we've devolved to.
Thank you so much for all of your insightful answers to all of our questions. And now just a fun last question to end everything off. We know you're a very avid runner, but that would even be an understatement. You would be closer to Forrest Gump. We know you actually run every single day and not just for a couple miles, but oftentimes half marathons or even longer distances. And for those of us who are just getting into running, I know Jason and we just recently did a half Ironman this summer, and I cannot begin to tell you about how much we were struggling and suffering in that final half marathon, and we are nowhere close to being marathon ready. But if you had any advice on any training or gear in general that has made the biggest difference for you in your running journey.
So actually, I don't run every day. I run 6 days a week. I hired a
Okay.
coach who told me that she would quit if I ran the seventh day. So for the last 3 or 4 years, I've only run 6 days.
Okay.
I actually think for me, actually having the coach, having someone to, design the training, oversee the training, sometimes push you to do more. In my case, sometimes push me to do less.
Right.
I think has been a real benefit. Running seems like the simplest sport in the world. I mean, you're like one foot in front of the other.
Mhm.
But there's a lot of nuances in
Yeah,
terms of
it's
how to
not easy.
train and do well, and having someone sort of manage that. But I admire you guys doing the half Ironman. One of the reasons I run so much is because I can't swim. So you guys have the swimming on me.
For sure. Thank you for that advice. And definitely, Jared and I will definitely look into that. We try to keep each other accountable, but every time one
Not
person
always,
runs,
not always, not always.
not
Every
always.
time I want to go the extra distance, there just seems to be someone beside me that says, "Slow down, let's take a break." That just happens to be Jason. So,
Yeah. Hopefully we can get do more running in the future. All right. That concludes our wonderful interview today. Again, Jared and I would like to extend the biggest of thank yous to Professor McCarty for this amazing opportunity and taking the time out of his incredibly busy schedule to come here and meet with us today. We're incredibly, incredibly grateful. So we truly thank you for that. All the listeners at home, if you guys wish to see more interviews like this, be sure to tune into future episodes. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you guys next time.